What if the quiet ranch hand you trusted with your life turned out to be a woman running from a past so dangerous, her only chance to survive was to become someone else? Guns will fire, secrets will unravel, and love might just bloom in the most unforgiving land on earth. Stay with us, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about the Old West. It wasn't the kind of day a man forgets. August 12, 1872. The sun had barely risen over the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, but already the air held that dry weight, a heavy, quiet kind of heat that whispered trouble. Ethan McGraw, a man who'd seen the worst of men during the Civil War, and then lost the best of women when his wife died 6 winters ago, had no idea that before nightfall, everything he thought he knew about his life, his ranch, and one particular ranch hand was about to come undone. It started the way most days did. Ethan rose before dawn, built the fire, brewed bitter coffee in an old tin pot that had outlasted 2 presidents and 1 marriage. The house was still, save for the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. The smell of dust and pine sap lingered, familiar, grounding. Out here, just east of Pinedale, Wyoming, life was hard, but at least it was predictable. Or so he believed. He walked the main yard with a measured pace, boots crunching over gravel and hay. His destination was the barn, to check on a mare that had been acting restless the night before. As he passed the corral, he noted the stillness. No sign of Will, the young ranch hand he'd hired just a few weeks earlier. That wasn't like the boy. Will Harper was usually the first up, already elbows deep in feed and saddle prep before Ethan took his second sip of coffee. The kid was green, yes, but sharp and fast, with a way around horses that suggested more experience than he claimed. And yet, something had always sat sideways about him. Not just his manner, too soft-spoken, too precise, but his movements. Graceful, Ethan had thought more than once, like a dancer trying to move like a rancher. Still, the boy worked hard, kept his head down, and never gave Ethan a reason to question anything, until that morning. Ethan pushed open the barn door and stepped into the cool gloom, blinking against the sudden shift in light. The usual smells met him: hay, manure, leather, horse sweat, but they were overlaid now by something else. Steam, soap, water. Then he heard it. Splashing. A slow, steady rhythm, someone bathing. In the stable. He frowned. That didn't make sense. The bunkhouse had a barrel and pump. No one used the barn for that kind of thing. Curiosity, edged with irritation, pulled him deeper into the cavernous space. He walked quietly, instinct honed by years of moving through danger. Around the far end of the haystack, near the foaling stall, he stopped cold. A large wooden tub sat beneath a shaft of morning light filtering through a crack in the barn wall. Steam curled up into the dusty air, and in that tub, back to him, shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear, was Will Harper. But the figure in the tub wasn't a boy. Ethan froze, the breath knocked from his chest as if he'd taken a rifle butt to the ribs. What he saw didn't make sense at first, his mind refusing to process it. The long, dark hair dripping wet down a pale back, the slender neck, the curve of hips that no man ever had. It was a woman who had been living on his ranch, working beside him, sleeping just one wall away, and he hadn't known. In that suspended moment, the world held its breath. The horse in the nearest stall shifted. The lantern near the door flickered, but Ethan didn't move. She turned. She must have sensed him or heard his step, because she twisted in the tub and gasped. Her eyes locked with his, wide, terrified, vulnerable. And Ethan saw it all then. The truth, the lie, the raw, naked fear. She grabbed for a towel, scrambling to cover herself, her voice breaking the silence like shattered glass. "Mr. McGraw, please." It wasn't the voice of a man. It wasn't even close. Ethan backed up a step. Everything in him screamed for answers, for logic, for control. But none of those things existed in this barn anymore. He turned and walked out into the sun, hands trembling, his heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't a man easily shocked. He had seen men torn apart by cannon fire, held his dying brother-in-law in his arms during Antietam. But this was something else. This was betrayal that felt personal. Minutes passed. Maybe more. He didn't know. He just stood there, staring out over the fence line until the door creaked behind him. She stepped out, hair still damp, hat in her hands. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice small but steady. "Clara Harper. I didn't mean to deceive you. I only wanted to survive." Ethan turned to face her. Her eyes, now that he looked closely, had never belonged to a man. They were too wide, too expressive. Haunted. "You're gonna tell me everything," he said, his voice low and tight. "And you're gonna start right now. Because in a land where every shadow might hold a bullet, every stranger might carry a secret, Ethan McGraw had just discovered the biggest one of all, and it had been standing beside him every day, wearing boots too big and a name that didn't belong. What came next would test everything he believed about loyalty, truth, and the fine line between justice and mercy. But for now, he just listened. And Clara Harper began to speak. Clara Harper had always known fear, but never like this. As the sun dipped behind the Wyoming mountains and shadows stretched long across the land, she sat by the hearth in Ethan McGraw's quiet ranch house, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of tea that shook slightly in her hands. Her secret, the one she had carried for miles, beneath layers of dust and denim, was no longer just hers. It had been ripped open that morning in the barn, and now she sat before a man who had every reason to send her packing, or worse. The fire snapped as a log cracked in two, echoing like distant gunfire. Clara flinched, instinctively hugging the mug closer. Across from her, Ethan sat still as stone. His eyes, though lined by years of hardship, were not cruel, but they watched her with the wary caution of a man who had been burned before. He had offered her no comfort, but he hadn't kicked her out either. That silence was the only mercy she had left. "I was born in Boston," she said finally, her voice low and steady, though her throat felt tight as rope. "To a world of rules and silk gloves. My father, Henry Harper, was a banker. My mother died when I was 10. After that, the house grew quiet and the expectations grew loud." Ethan said nothing. His face betrayed nothing. "They wanted me married," Clara continued, "to a man named Silas Drayton, son of one of the wealthiest ship owners in the city. A connection forged not from love, but from power. My father said he'd saved our family. What he meant was, he'd bought my future with a signature." She looked up then, eyes gleaming in the firelight. Silas was not a good man, charming in public, brutal in private. He had already broken one wife, and they expected me to be next. The words landed heavy in the room. Ethan's jaw shifted, just barely. I tried to fight it, pleaded, cried, but my father had made up his mind, said if I disobeyed, I'd be cut off from everything, money, protection, even my name. She laughed, dry and bitter. So I took it from him before he could. I stole what I could carry, cut my hair, and took my brother's old boots, his name too. And I ran. Outside, a wind picked up, whistling softly through the cracks in the window. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. I thought I could disappear, that if I went far enough, west enough, the past wouldn't follow. I cleaned floors in Denver, slept in barns, got a job mucking stalls in Cheyenne. But every time someone noticed something. The way I moved, my voice, my handwriting, it didn't take much. Just one person whispering the wrong word to the wrong man. So I kept moving. Ethan stirred. "And you landed here?" She nodded. "Your ad said you needed help, that you paid fair and didn't ask questions. I thought maybe this could be the place I could finally stop running." He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "You ever kill anyone, Clara?" She looked at him, unblinking. "Not yet." That answer hung in the air, dark and unresolved. "I don't take kindly to liars," he said finally. "I didn't lie about the work," she replied, almost defiantly. "Every fence I fixed, every horse I trained, every blister I earned, that was real. The name wasn't, but the rest, it was all me." Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw. "And what happens when someone comes looking? This Silas fella, or bounty men?" Clara met his gaze. "Then I face them. Or I run again. I've had practice." He studied her a long while. The fire popped again, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Finally, he spoke. "You'll stay, for now, but you keep to your chores. You speak the truth from here on out. And if trouble rides in, you don't lie about what brought it." Relief broke across her face like dawn. She nodded quickly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Ethan muttered, standing. "The West's a cruel place for honest men. Crueler still for women pretending to be one." That night, Clara lay in the bunkhouse, staring at the rafters. The wind rattled the roof. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. Her heart still pounded from the day's reveal, but beneath the fear, something unexpected bloomed. Hope. Maybe this place wouldn't just be a hiding spot. Maybe it could be more. Maybe it could be home. That hope, however fragile, grew stronger each day. Clara woke before dawn, just as she had before, and threw herself into the work. She hauled feed, mended fences, broke colts, and earned the trust of the horses as well as the men around them. She made no excuses, asked for no favors. But she also no longer hid behind a name that wasn't hers. She worked as Clara, openly now, even if most didn't yet know it. Ethan, for his part, said little, but she could feel the difference in his gaze. It had changed from suspicion to something more unreadable, protective, perhaps, respectful. It wasn't warm, not quite, but it wasn't cold either. Once, as she was saddling a horse, she caught him watching her from across the yard. Their eyes met. He gave a single, slow nod, then turned away. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Still, not every moment was easy. Clara flinched at sudden noises. She scanned every horizon. When strangers rode past the property, her breath caught in her throat until they were gone. Trust, like her wounds, would take time to heal. But healing, she realized, was happening. Slowly, but surely. She hadn't expected to feel anything but fear on this ranch. But each day that passed without boots at the door or a bounty hunter calling her name felt like a small miracle. She was not safe. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, Clara Harper wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to live. The wind that blew across Pinedale wasn't just dry and full of dust. It carried with it whispers, rumors, suspicions that clung to a man's name long after the truth had slipped away. It was the kind of town where secrets didn't stay buried for long, and where a sideways glance could hold more weight than a written confession. On the surface, it was a place of handshakes and neighborly nods, but underneath, it simmered with old grudges and quiet reckonings. Clara Harper had walked into that boiling kettle the day she stepped off Ethan McGraw's wagon and into town as Will. For a while, she had gone unnoticed. A quiet ranch hand with a wiry frame and quick hands didn't raise too many eyebrows. But over time, little things began to stack up, like dry twigs before a spark. Deputy Clyde Weston, Pinedale's lawman, wasn't the kind of man to go looking for trouble. Trouble usually found him anyway. He had a slow, deliberate way of speaking, and a sharper-than-average sense when something didn't sit right. And from the moment he laid eyes on Will Harper, something didn't. It wasn't just the mannerisms, the overly stiff posture, the hat pulled too low, or the way the boy avoided the saloon like it was poisoned. No, it was subtler than that. The way his hand twitched toward his hair in a too familiar motion. The way his eyes darted like someone always expecting to be seen for who they really were. Weston had learned to read men in war and in peace, and what he saw in Will was a question that refused to go unanswered. The town itself began to buzz. Not loud at first, just a murmur behind closed doors. The general store clerk whispered to her husband about how that McGraw kid moved too gracefully. A rancher mentioned, half joking, that Will had softer hands than he ought to. Someone else swore they'd caught a glimpse of long hair beneath that ever-present hat. Ethan heard the rumors, of course. He always did. They reached him like smoke under a door, uninvited and hard to ignore. But he said nothing. He kept his head down and watched Clara work harder than any man he'd hired in years. Her strength wasn't brute, but it was steady. Her resolve wasn't loud, but it was constant. And still, something gnawed at him. Not doubt. He'd already made his peace with who she was. But worry. Because secrets, once uncovered, didn't just fade away. They hunted. They stalked. And as it turned out, someone was hunting. His name was Travis Deeds, and he rode into Pinedale with a crooked smile and eyes like flint. Bounty hunter by trade, ex-scout by habit, and predator by instinct. He didn't say much when he arrived. Just bought a beer, posted a few questions, and let the scent of fear do the rest. He didn't need to show the bounty poster he carried in his coat, though he did to one or two barkeeps who owed him favors. The face on that poster wasn't Clara's. It was a sketch of a woman in finer clothes with pinned-up hair and city eyes. But the name was right. Clara Harper, wanted back east, by her family, or by a man with money and vengeance to spare, alive. $500. In towns like Pinedale, $500 could buy a future or bury a past. The whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to sideways stares. And Clara, now going to town once a week for supplies, felt every single one of them. The walls of her disguise, once carefully built, were beginning to crack. She avoided the saloon altogether now, took side streets and kept her head down. But the damage had been done. One evening, Ethan found her sitting by the barn, shoulders slumped, hands dirty from mucking stalls, but her eyes, those fierce, bright eyes, looked lost. "I can't go into town anymore," she said without looking up. He stood beside her, silent for a long time. Then, after a moment, "I'll go. I don't want to be the reason your name starts getting dragged through the dirt. My name's been through worse." She finally looked at him. "They know. Maybe not all of it, but enough. And someone's coming." Ethan nodded slowly. "Let him come. I've got a rifle, 2 dogs, and more sense than most of them combined." But Clara wasn't comforted, because the kind of man who would pay to find her didn't send drunks or cowards. He sent professionals, and she had the scars to prove it. Deputy Weston watched the town change in small, sharp ways. A stranger at the saloon asking one too many questions. A poster that went missing from the telegraph wall. A shadow slipping through alleys just before dusk. And so, one morning, he rode out to the McGraw ranch. Not with accusations, but with curiosity. Ethan met him at the gate. "Something I can help you with, Clyde?" The deputy shifted in his saddle. "Just checking in. Heard some talk in town. Thought I'd clear the air." Ethan didn't blink. "Clear it fast. My horses don't like being watched." Clyde gave a small nod. "Just be careful. There's a man in town looking for someone. Says he's a traitor. He ain't." With that, he turned and rode off, leaving Ethan staring at the horizon, his thoughts heavier than the sky. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat up, revolver in hand, her eyes trained on the window. Ethan did the same in his cabin, and somewhere beyond the hills, a campfire burned low, and Travis Deeds smiled in the dark, waiting for dawn. The question was no longer if the truth would catch up. It was how much blood it would spill when it did. There are moments in life that split time in half, before and after. What happened the night the fire line crossed McGraw Ranch was one of those moments, a sharp, searing scar that left nothing untouched. It began not with a gunshot or a shout, but with a silence so heavy it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. It was just past midnight when Clara woke with a start. No thunder, no coyotes, just a strange prickling at the base of her neck. A knowing. She'd lived too long in fear to mistake it for anything else. She slipped from her cot in the bunkhouse, boots barely making a sound as she stepped outside into the cool night. The stars were high, the moon pale and watchful. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement at the far ridge. She crouched low, heart hammering in her chest, eyes straining in the dark. 3 silhouettes, moved like ghosts, cautious, practiced. Not drunk ranch hands or thieves. These were professionals, and they were headed straight for the house. She didn't wait, she ran. Ethan was already halfway out his door when she reached him. He held his Winchester at the ready, his eyes narrowing when he saw her face. No words needed. Trouble had come. They moved together like they'd done it 100 times. Ethan checked the perimeter while Clara darted into the barn to release the horses. If a fight was coming, the animals had to be free. She paused only once, stroking the neck of the mare she'd helped nurse through a tough spring. "Run if you hear shooting," she whispered. Outside, the shadows spread. From behind the barn, a voice called out, smooth and cold. "Evening, Mr. McGraw. Fine night for a reckoning." Ethan stepped forward, rifle raised. "You've got the wrong ranch." A laugh followed, low, cruel. "I don't think so. I'm looking for Clara Harper. Word is she's hiding out here. See, a man back east is mighty anxious to get his bride back, paid handsomely for her return." Clara stepped out beside Ethan, gun drawn, jaw tight. "Well, he can keep waiting," she said. From the trees, a figure lunged forward, and all hell broke loose. The first shot cracked through the night like lightning. Horses screamed, men shouted. The air filled with smoke and dirt and fear. Clara dropped to her knees and returned fire, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She saw one of the intruders fall, hit in the leg. Another ducked behind the water trough. The third, big and fast, made it to the front porch. Ethan met him there. They crashed into each other with a sickening thud. Ethan's rifle fired once, then was knocked from his grip. They grappled like bulls, fists flying, boots grinding into the wooden planks. Clara couldn't shoot. Not with Ethan so close. Instead, she ran toward the barn, grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the wall and charged. The man turned just as she struck, the tines slicing into his arm. He screamed, stumbled, and Ethan finished it with a punch that dropped him like a sack of grain. Silence returned, broken only by ragged breathing. But it wasn't over. A rustle came from behind. Clara spun, and found herself face to face with Travis Deeds. He looked exactly as she remembered him, weathered, snake-eyed, and dangerous. The last time she'd seen him, he'd dragged a girl from a train car screaming. That girl hadn't made it home. "Well now," he drawled. "Didn't expect you to come out so brave." "I didn't expect you to follow me across 3 states," Clara replied, keeping her gun trained on him. $500 does wonders for a man's motivation. Ethan raised his own rifle behind Clara. "And what's your plan now?" Travis grinned. "Take the girl, leave the old man, simple." "Not tonight." Clara fired first. The bullet missed, but just barely. Travis dove, rolled, and came up firing. Clara dropped, the shot grazing her shoulder, burning hot through flesh. Ethan fired and clipped Travis's thigh. The man stumbled back, blood blooming in the dirt. Clara, gritting her teeth, rose and fired again. This time it hit. Travis collapsed, groaning, the fight bleeding out of him. Ethan walked over, rifle still aimed. "You're lucky I don't bury you right here." Travis coughed, then spat. "She's marked, McGraw. There'll be others, always are." Ethan looked at Clara. Then he looked out into the night. "Then we'll be ready." By morning, the sheriff from Pinedale had come, with 2 deputies in tow. They loaded the wounded men onto a wagon, muttering about broken laws and foolish pride. Deputy Weston stayed behind for a moment, standing beside the battered porch. "She held her own," he said, tipping his hat toward Clara. "She did more than that," Ethan replied. They didn't speak again. When the dust finally settled and the sun crept up over the hills, Clara stood alone at the edge of the field, watching the horizon. Her shoulder throbbed. Her heart ached. But she was alive, not hiding, not pretending, not running, alive. The barn still smelled of gunpowder. The ground wore the memory of boot prints and blood. But peace, true peace, had come at a cost. And as she watched the horses grazing freely again, Clara knew something had changed. Not just the danger that had passed, but something deeper, something that had anchored itself inside her. She was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder. For the first time, she imagined a life not lived in disguise, not shackled by fear. A life where she could wake up with the sun, work the land, and sleep without a pistol under her pillow. A life where she could be known, and maybe, just maybe, be loved. Ethan joined her at the fence, his arm in a sling, the other holding a coffee tin. He handed it to her without a word. She took a sip, then asked, "You think they'll send more?" "I do," he said, "but next time we won't be caught off guard." They stood in silence, side by side, staring into the rising light. 2 fighters, 2 survivors, and somewhere between the lines of that quiet, a bond formed stronger than anything spoken aloud. Whatever came next, they would face it together. When dawn broke over McGraw Ranch the morning after the gunfire, it didn't come gently. The light came hard and gold across a landscape still bruised from the night's violence, and the silence that followed felt more like the aftermath of a funeral than the start of a new day. Smoke from spent gunpowder lingered low over the fields, and the ground outside the barn bore the deep, ugly tracks of boots that had come with cruel intentions and left carrying their wounded. Clara stood on the porch, her arm bandaged, her face streaked with soot and dried blood. She looked out over the land that had become something more than just shelter. It had become a mirror to everything she thought she had lost. Freedom, purpose, maybe even home. The townsfolk arrived slowly at first, then all at once. Deputy Weston came early, riding in with 2 men from the sheriff's office. Behind him, the blacksmith, the general store owner, a handful of ranchers. They'd all heard the gunfire, and they'd all heard the whispers. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, a small crowd had gathered. Not angry, not hostile, but curious, and carrying a weight of something else. Maybe awe, maybe reckoning. Clara stepped down from the porch and walked into their view. Her hair, usually pinned and hidden beneath a hat, now flowed freely. Her walk was steady, shoulders squared, eyes unafraid. "She's the one," someone whispered. "The ranch hand?" another asked. "No," said the blacksmith, shaking his head slowly. "The woman." Deputy Weston stepped forward. "Miss Harper?" Clara gave a small nod. "Deputy. You all right?" "I am now." He studied her for a long moment. "You fought. Protected this land like it was your own." "It felt like mine." He nodded once, slowly. "Far as I'm concerned, you earned that right." No one argued. Ethan appeared then, his shoulder in a sling, but his eyes clear. He stood beside Clara, not in front of her, not shielding her, but beside her. As an equal, as something more. He didn't speak right away. Ethan McGraw was a man who only used words when silence failed. But now, he cleared his throat and looked at the people he'd shared this town with for decades. "This woman," he began, "came here with nothing but fear on her back and steel in her spine. She worked harder than any man I've ever hired. She earned every meal, every dollar, and every ounce of respect I've got." He turned toward her then, the crowd fading behind the gravity of what he was about to say. "I lost my wife 6 years ago. Thought I'd buried the part of me that could feel anything close to connection. I was wrong, because you reminded me what it means to fight for something, what it means to care." Clara blinked, her throat tightening. He took a step closer. "I don't care what name you came here with. I only care about the one I hope you'll carry when you stay." The crowd held its breath. Ethan reached out, gently took her hand. "Clara Harper, will you stay and be my wife?" The moment stretched, tender and raw. Clara looked into his eyes, and for once, she didn't see the fear of being hunted. She didn't feel the panic of needing to run. What she saw, what she felt, was peace. Earned, deserved, real. Her answer wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. "Yes," she whispered, "I will." There was no applause, no grand celebration, just a quiet understanding among all who stood witness that something rare had happened here, something old as the land itself. Two souls choosing each other in a world that gave them every reason not to. The weeks that followed were not easy. There were still men out there who would chase a bounty, still gossip in town, still the weight of what had been. But the fear that had once followed Clara like a second shadow no longer defined her days. She walked through the market with her head held high, spoke with neighbors not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. Ethan, for his part, began to smile again. Not often, but when he did, it was real. And when Clara caught him watching her with that quiet, reverent gaze, like a man who'd found something worth believing in, she knew the risk had been worth it. They worked side by side, fixing fences, raising foals, rebuilding what had been broken. And in those small, ordinary acts, they built a new life. One forged not from pretense, but from hard-earned truth. At night, they sat on the porch and watched the stars wheel slowly above them. Sometimes they spoke of the past, not to dwell, but to remind themselves how far they'd come. Clara would rest her head against Ethan's good shoulder, and he would rest his hand over hers, and in those quiet moments words weren't necessary. The land had tested them, the world had tried to tear them apart, but together they had stood their ground. She was no longer a fugitive. She was a woman who had fought for her life, and found it. And Ethan, once a man hollowed out by loss, now lived not just for the ranch, but for the quiet strength that had walked into his barn one dusty morning and refused to be anything but free. So the question remains, for every man or woman who's ever had to choose between fear and love, silence and truth, what would you do? Would you run forever? Or would you finally stop, look someone in the eye, and choose to stay? Clara did, and that changed everything. Clara Harper's story is one that begins with a lie, a necessary lie, born out of desperation and stitched with the raw thread of survival. She left behind a life of privilege and confinement in Boston, trading silk gloves for splintered wood, corsets for work shirts, and a name spoken with respect for one whispered in secrecy. She disguised herself as a man not to deceive, but to survive. What began as escape evolved into something far greater, a reckoning with identity, courage, and the unrelenting pursuit of freedom. At McGraw Ranch, Clara didn't just find shelter, she found the conditions to discover who she truly was. With every fence she mended, every foal she calmed, and every meal she earned with sweat and sore hands, she chipped away at the fear that had followed her westward. Her disguise was a wall she built to protect herself, but behind that wall, Clara was still very much alive, fierce, capable, and yearning to be more than just a shadow among men. And then came Ethan McGraw, a man forged by loss and hardened by solitude. He hired Will Harper, unaware he was letting a fugitive into his life. But what unfolded between Ethan and Clara was not a love story born of savior and damsel, but one of equals who saw each other through the silence. Their bond formed not through words, but through work, through firelight and shared burdens, through the quiet realization that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, not with promises but with presence. Ethan, who had buried the softer parts of himself after the death of his wife, found in Clara not a replacement but a reminder that to live was to risk, that to love was to choose someone even when the world gave you every excuse not to. Clara, for her part, found in Ethan something she had never known before, not protection, but partnership, a man who stood beside her, not in front of her. But even in the wild expanse of Wyoming, the past has long arms. When bounty hunters came, when bullets pierced the night, when secrets spilled like blood in the dust, Clara didn't run. She stood her ground. She fought not just for her life, but for her right to live it on her terms. In doing so, she earned more than survival. She earned respect. She earned love. And most importantly, she earned the right to stop pretending. The townspeople, wary and watchful, had a choice to make. They could shun her, or they could recognize the truth standing in front of them. A woman who had proven, beyond any doubt, that worth is not worn on the outside. It is earned, lived, fought for. And so Clara stayed, not as Will, not as a fugitive, but as herself, as a rancher, as a wife, as a woman who had walked through fire and come out tempered like steel. Her journey offers us something rare, a reflection of the battles we all fight. Maybe your disguise isn't a name or a change of clothes. Maybe it's a smile you wear to hide your exhaustion, a job that pays the bills but starves the soul, a silence kept to avoid judgment. We all carry versions of ourselves shaped by fear and need, but Clara reminds us that masks grow heavy. And there is a freedom that comes, not from escape, but from standing still and saying, "This is who I am." We learn from her that truth, even when dangerous, is the only path to peace, that love, when based on honesty and respect, is stronger than any pretense. That identity is not something we're given. It's something we fight for. In a world still full of judgment, still quick to label and slow to listen, Clara's story asks us to look deeper, to see people not for the roles they play, but for the lives they lead behind the curtain, to choose compassion over curiosity, understanding over assumption. And Ethan, he teaches us that healing is not the absence of pain, but the willingness to feel again. That sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is open his door to someone broken, someone different, someone honest. In doing so, he opened his own heart again. So what about you? What mask are you wearing? What part of yourself are you hiding, waiting for the world to be safe enough to show it? Maybe today is the day to start becoming visible. Maybe this is your sign to stop running, not from danger, but from yourself. Maybe the truth you've buried is the very thing that will set you free. Clara Harper stopped running, and it changed everything. If her story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own scars, or your own second chance, then don't let it end here. Support stories like this. Stories that speak to the soul, that honor grit and grace, and that remind us that every life, even the messy, hidden, painful ones, deserves to be told. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, share this story, not for the numbers but for the message, because someone out there needs to hear this, needs to know they're not alone, and maybe, just maybe, their story is the next one we'll tell.